Speech Act, but security can also be a practice, and that is one of the examples. This also leads me to the final aspect of my presentation, which is about the book that we wrote. Firstly, in 2019, we wrote a book on securitization here, Refugees, Security, and Europe, where we looked at the issue of asylum policies in Europe, and something that many scholars had discussed as having been constructed as a security problem. So what we did was we looked at that issue. Had it actually been constructed as a security problem? And at the level of the European Union, in fact, it hadn't. At the level of the European Union, it had not been accepted as a security problem. It hadn't even been rhetorically constructed as a security issue. But what we found here was, especially what I was telling you about the practices, and that is something that changed significantly after the big migration crisis of 2015, 2016, that increasingly more and more actors were constructing it as a security problem. Now, when it came to EU asylum policy, it wasn't accepted by the audience as a security issue. So, for instance, policymakers weren't necessarily writing in their policy documents at all that this is a security threat. They weren't dealing with it as a security threat in rhetorical terms. And in fact, when it comes to the legal aspects, they were still actually according a lot of rights to refugees, in fact, increasing rights to refugees also, even in those years. But what we then argued in the book was that you need to go beyond just looking at the construction in terms of discourse, and you need to look also at the practices. And the practices that we identified that you need to look at are the practices at the border. So the practices that we looked at in terms of the border were precisely areas where indeed refugees were constructed as a security threat through practices, not through speeches, but through practices. For instance, when people were crossing the Mediterranean from, let's say, Libya into Italy, or they were crossing the Mediterranean from Turkey into Greece, then we see that military battleships were arriving. We see that they were dealing with it in that particular way. We also see a certain construction, or rather association of refugees with certain terrorist practices, making it therefore, in a sense, an urgent issue to deal with, primarily through practices, but also through associations, in particular through to terrorism. So this is why we argue that despite the fact that you will not find statements, you will not find documents that show that security, that refugees are perceived as a security threat, it is through certain practices at the border, it's through practices, through associations, through linking of issues between terrorism and migration that we've managed to, in a sense, get an acceptance for that. And we see that in terms of the policy as it developed subsequently, that it was much, much more difficult to see, in a sense, refugees as a humanitarian issue. At the beginning of the crisis, like in fact in 2015, we see very much that refugees are being perceived as a humanitarian issue. We see, for instance, in Germany, people welcoming a lot of refugees. There were even slogans in terms of refugees welcome. There were like people meeting them at various train stations and so on. So we see that being treated as a humanitarian issue. But of course, over time, we see a year, 2 years later, especially after a number of terror attacks that happened, first in Paris, then we see a number of other terror attacks, for instance, in Berlin, in Brussels, of course, in Barcelona, in Istanbul, in a couple of different places, in London, of course, and in Manchester. And these terror attacks start changing the perception. The issues start being linked, even though the majority of terror attacks were not conducted by refugees, but there were 1 or 2, maybe 3 people that, while they were not refugees, they were using the refugee flows through the Mediterranean to enter Europe. And as a result of that, the issue starts being linked. And by being linked, the issue starts being perceived as a security threat. So ultimately, then the book concludes that, contrary to the perception that security is something that is constructed merely through a speech act. Actually, it's constructed through certain practices. It is a very significant event, especially 2015, 2016, in terms of for that to happen, despite the fact that people were writing about this before. It didn't really happen until 2015, 2016. In fact, you can even point to 2017 as the aftermath of some of those attacks where this is starting to be accepted as a security threat. But it has certain implications, of course. And the implication is that it has become more complicated and more difficult for asylum seekers to reach the borders of the European Union, because it is the borders, in fact, that they need to reach in order to claim asylum status. And while the asylum status itself is at a higher legal value than it's ever been before, so the rights that are accorded to refugees who do make it to Europe are higher than they ever have been before. But because it's harder now to actually reach, because it's become more and more difficult to really claim asylum, therefore, in a sense, this is not really obtainable for many asylum seekers. So that is, in a sense, the conclusion of the book. So at this point, I'll probably stop talking as well, so that you have some time for asking many questions. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Christian, for your brilliant session and for enlightening us and my students regarding international security and what you think security is. And you also talked about your book regarding securitization and probably refugee. I don't recall the title exactly, but we have got some questions here in the hall. So who is up for a question first? Okay. Come here. Introduce the person.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Mahnur Shakir, and I'm from BSIR Batch 3. And my question is, what is the difference between vulnerability and a threat in the context of information security?
So, thank you very much for the question. So the question is about what is the difference between vulnerability, but I didn't hear the second thing. What was the second thing?
And in the context of information threat in the context of information security.
So, Christian, she's asking, what's the difference between vulnerability and threat in the context of information security?
Yes, yes. Well, that's a very, very good question. Of course, information security is a very, very, well, it's in a sense a new arena for security, if you like. It's a new plane almost. So vulnerability, of course, means something quite different. Generally, when we see vulnerability, we see different weak points of individuals, of societies, of course, states, perhaps regional organizations, and so on. And we deal with it in a kind of humanitarian fashion. Usually, for instance, like I mentioned, when it comes to refugees and so on, we deal with it as a humanitarian issue and help. So that's kind of generally as it is. But in information society, of course, vulnerability is something rather different. Here, vulnerability is how perhaps your company is vulnerable, how your computer systems are vulnerable, how, in a sense, you're vulnerable to a certain attack. And of course, in this particular instance, we'll be dealing it in a way more of a defensive issue, right? We're dealing with it by kind of, in a sense, trying to reduce the vulnerability by closing, in a sense, the option for an external threat to really attack us. So in that sense, it is somewhat of a different meaning. So I guess it's something very interesting, and I hope that you also work a little bit on that to give us more clarity on how these concepts are changing in an information society.
All right.